Welcome to Venezuelanalysis End of Year podcast. I'm your host, José Luis Granados Ceja. This is a special episode, a bit different from the rest, where we'll be reviewing the top stories of the year as chosen by the staff. And the whole team is here. I'm joined by Cira Pascual Marquina, Andreína Chávez, and Ricardo Vaz. So here at Venezuelanalysis, I tend to focus on the stories that have an international or regional angle. So we're going to start with that. And I thought for me, one of the biggest stories this year in that regard was the high level US delegation to Venezuela. As we know, the delegation led by White House Latin America advisor Juan Gonzalez travels to Caracas in March of this year, where they met directly with Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and Vice President Delcy Rodriguez. We know Venezuela broke off diplomatic relations with the US in 2019 after they recognized opposition figure Juan Guaido as interim president. And with Biden largely keeping Trump's maximal pressure strategy in place, it seemed like the US strategy towards Venezuela was, in a sense, focused on isolating Maduro, imposing these crippling sanctions on the country, especially the energy sector, seizing, together with allies, the country's forest assets. And I think one of the ways that we could sum up the March visit is by pointing out that this is essentially a collapse of that strategy. How are you trying to isolate somebody and then meeting with them? We know that this meeting was actually followed by a subsequent one in June that was more focused around the US citizens that were in Venezuelan custody. But nonetheless, it was two high level delegations. And I think that if these delegations to Venezuela by the US were a fatal blow to the Interinato, right? We know Juan Guaido wasn't even invited. He wasn't even told of the meetings. Certainly the first one, he was told the morning of that it was happening and didn't even have a chance to meet with the US delegation, some president, right? But anyway, if that was the fatal blow, then I think the trip to the COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh in some ways was the death rattle of the Interinato. We saw Maduro being sought out by French President Emmanuel Macron, shaking hands with US climate envoy John Kerry, even if Washington tried to play down the event. Far from being isolated, Maduro was once again on center stage, representing Venezuela as he should as a democratically elected president. The proxy war in Ukraine has really forced imperialism to suspend certain aspects of its hybrid war in Venezuela. This is the result of that. And, I think it's important to point out that the end of the isolation of the Maduro government is due to changes in the region. We've seen leftists and progressives elected in contests throughout the hemisphere, and that means that imperialism now has fewer allies who will tolerate or even facilitate their interference in Venezuela. So I know personally, I feel a certain sense of anti imperialist pride to see that US strategy fail. But can it be said that Venezuela has triumphed? Thoughts?
I think it depends a bit on what we define by triumph. If we're talking simply about this maximum pressure, make Venezuela a pariah state, then certainly it has triumphed. Nobody even dares to call Guaido president anymore, except his acolytes. I remember in the beginning of the Trump strategy, we had these idiotic statements by then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo referring to Maduro as the former president of Venezuela, as if that would magically change reality on the ground. So in that sense, it's kind of discourse catching up to reality, because for all the talk and all the international tours that Guaido had got to do, reality on the ground was always that Maduro was in charge in the meaningful sense of the word. He is the elected president. The government, in all these difficulties, which I'm sure we'll discuss, was the one paying wages and handling security and all the things that are associated with the state. So in the sense, now you get to see this victory lap by the Maduro government, kind of rubbing in everyone's faces that you tried to oust us and you failed. Whereas that amounts to a triumph, we'll have to see, because these very harsh sanctions are still in place. I'm sure we'll dedicate a lot of time to that. But it has at least gained some ground in terms of, on one hand, forcing the US to change strategy. And we kind of know from these ever-present anonymous sources that the Biden administration wasn't convinced by the Trump strategy, but because it doesn't have too much of a spine and doesn't want to create any kind of scandals that would cost them political points, they didn't really know how to shift from it until the conflict in Ukraine began, and it kind of became urgent to address the volatility in global energy markets, and they came to Venezuela, and this was really a surprise. Politics in Venezuela is always unpredictable, so there's always a lot of work for journalists like us. But this, even by that standard, was very surprising when we found out that there was a U.S. delegation on its way to Venezuela. So to sum up, I think some progress, but still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, basically, with delegations, I want to highlight something that is already been said. But basically, the Ukraine war begins on February 24th, and the first US delegation happens in early March. So basically, I think that the geopolitical situation shifts or opens for the possibility of, as Ricardo was saying, with the Biden delegation perhaps wanting to generate a different kind of relationship in terms of oil purchases from Venezuela, but not having the whereabouts to do it. The Ukraine war kind of like opens up the way, but it is only more recently, I mean, actually in the last week, that things have actually begun to really change with the dialogues in Mexico and with basically with the chiefs in terms of the Chevron license.
Yeah, I also wanted to add something like really brief because I agree with Ricardo that Guaido never had any kind of political power in Venezuela besides maybe publishing pointless videos on Twitter. But I mean, there is one aspect of the Guaido experiment that was successful and continues to be successful, and that is stealing Venezuelan funds and assets abroad. And you have to remember that they use Guaido as an excuse to steal Citgo, the oil subsidiary in the US. And they use him as an excuse to say that now Citgo is going to be under control of Guaido, under control of the Venezuelan opposition. And this happened in 2019. In fact, President Maduro was saying recently that Citgo has accumulated at least $4 billion in profit in these 4 years. And so there are a lot of resources that they have stolen because they use Guaido as the excuse to do that. So yeah, I just wanted to sort of remember that.
Yeah, and also remember that there are Venezuelans who are continuing to resist this and are very much cognizant of the impacts of US policy towards Venezuela, but nonetheless continue to persevere and find creative solutions, working class solutions to the problems that are generated by US imperialism in Venezuela. And that brings me to our next story that we want to talk about in terms of the important events of 2022. So we know that the Unión Comunera held its Congress, and some of our staff was actually able to participate and personally witness and see that momentous occasion. Ricardo, talk to us about the Unión Comunera Congress. Why was it important? Why is this your top story for 2022?
Indeed, when we were talking about which stories to select, this was the first one that came to my mind because I think this popular power is perhaps the topic that's less covered in the corporate media, and so the one that we make the biggest effort to get it out there so the readers can understand what's going on. And this is, in fact, a key component of the Bolivarian process, beyond the geopolitical implications and the anti-imperialism. This bottom-up construction is really important. And on the matter of grassroots resistance against the U.S. blockade, we have published, Cira has been doing some great work in publishing a series of interviews with communes and other popular organizations to understand how this resistance has come from popular organization. So the Communard Union, just to be brief, is an organization bringing together communes across the country to build an alliance on a national scale. So right now there are between 50 and 60 communes participating. Communes, just to recall, were defined by Chávez as the unit cell for the construction of socialism. They are territorial, democratic units of self-government. And so the crisis has meant a lot of setbacks for these types of socialist organization because, I mean, we have to be self-critical as well. There was a lot of dependence on state resources, which was hurt by the crisis and then further hampered by sanctions. There was migration, a lot of things, which meant significant setbacks for popular power. But then at some point, these organizations started to get together and realize that if they united and tried to join forces, then they could move forward. So this Congress was very significant in that regard. It was kind of a culmination of a process that was already a couple of years in the works. And it was very inspiring for us to be there. I mean, there's always a kind of despair that comes into you at some point when you think that perhaps the most advanced elements of the socialist project here have faded. But then you go out and you see that that's not the case. And even sometimes we just fall into the same handful of communists that have a lot of projection, and it can give the illusion that there's nothing else. But then you go to these meetings, and you realize that there's a lot of work being done. There's a lot of very committed activists and militants across the country. Perhaps they don't have such a successful communications policy. But one aspect that I'd highlight from the Communist Union Congress, of course, there's a lot of work ahead, is perhaps some of the implications that were apparent just in this microcosm. So this brought together some 500 communards from some 50 communes across the country. They gathered in El Maizal, in Lara State, that's kind of northwestern Venezuela. And there were rumors that the government, and Maduro in particular, was not very happy with, but who was then his commune minister, that she was not aware that these very radical and committed hundreds of communards were gathering, and she had no idea that this was going on. So on the spot, or in this day, he actually appointed a new commune minister, someone who's probably more familiar to our audience, Jorge Arriaza, former foreign minister. And he came to the Communist Union Congress the next day to salute the communards and so on. But it kind of highlighted this, what has always been a difficult relationship, a complex relation rather, with the state, which sometimes supports this grassroots construction, but at some point also wants to co-opt. And it's always a struggle, a tense relationship between bottom-up construction and top-down practices. But it went to show that communes are still very much a relevant factor in Venezuela, and hopefully, I know there's a lot of effort being put in. The Communist Union can continue to strengthen and to reiterate that socialism is really the horizon for this project.
Indeed, the Congress, which happened in early March 3rd and 4th, I think, the Congress was really extraordinary. And I think that one of the things that stuck to my mind is what Ángel Prado, who is the key leader, spokesperson of El Maizal Commune, what he said when he was doing his opening remarks, which were really, very interesting. He said that basically a few years before, El Maizal had found itself facing both the counter-revolution and the reformist, what he called the fifth column, an internal reformist fifth column. So basically he was highlighting that in the face of the situation, with obviously kind of like the imperialist siege on Venezuela, which has an impact on everybody's life, and the historical right in Venezuela, which is very violent. In the face of that, but also in the face of a sort of reformist tendency or what he called the fifth column within the government, that they began to reflect on the need to build coordination, space for different communes to come together. And this is actually very important because the commune, basically Chávez in Aló Presidente Teórico number 1, which is the first space where Chávez actually does a big kind of like address and reflection on what the commune is. Chávez said that the commune that stays isolated can actually become counter-revolutionary. And Chávez always emphasized the need for communes to bring together. If communes are, and they are indeed basically the basic cell for building socialism, but you cannot build socialism on an island. So then that's why Chávez called for actually he talked about the federation of communes as a need and as an objective to build the post-capitalist communal society. So this was a really interesting space. A lot of interesting people from the different communes talking about their experiences, reflections on the political conjuncture, and finally, on the second or the third day, the second day, Jorge Arriaza, who Ricardo was just mentioning, came to the Congress and made some remarks as well. But basically, the objective of the Congress was a self-run, and it was a self-run initiative with the objective of strengthening the ties between communes and, in general, strengthening the communal project as a whole.
Certainly, nowhere do I feel like socialism is actually on the horizon than when we talk about the communes, when we talk about the efforts, the grassroots efforts in Venezuela to truly build a different kind of society, different kinds of social relations. It's truly incredible. And I can't help but think about this character on Twitter who was trolling our account a few days ago, talking about how, Venezuelanalysis is a bunch of stooges and all we do is toe the government line, when obviously what we try to do principally is to amplify the voices of the Bolivarian grassroots, the people who are deeply engaged in this process of actually building socialism and under incredibly difficult circumstances. No one like Venezuelans understand imperialism and its actions to try to dominate a country. And so I think it's incredible the work that we've been able to do, and the work that we did around the Congress, also really trying to amplify the voices so that people understand that this is a very real process of construction to build socialism in Venezuela. And I want to stay on this topic of grassroots mobilization to move on to our next topic of 2022. So, Cira, you were mentioning that for you, the big story this year was the mobilization of Venezuelan women and their allies, the feminist march that happened not too long ago in September. Talk to us about this event.
On September 28th, thousands of Venezuelan women took the streets of Caracas for the decriminalization of abortion. I guess I should give a little bit of a context first. September 28th is actually the day for access to safe abortion. And in Venezuela, abortion is criminalized with basically a penal code that is about 100 years old. And the criminalization of abortion in Venezuela is really on the continent, is basically with Paraguay and Guatemala as the most retrograde legislation when it comes to sexual and reproductive rights. So Venezuela's anti-abortion legislation basically bans abortion, including in cases of rape, of incest, of fetus inviolability. And there are 4 articles in the penal code that basically establish that a person who carries out an abortion will get 6 months to 2 years in prison, and a doctor or a person who helps in the process will face 1 to 3 years in jail. So basically, and this is, as I was saying, the Venezuelan penal code dates back to the earliest 20th century, and that's where we have these. That's how we inherit this very backward legislation. Of course, which women can abort here in clandestine conditions. There are organizations of women who accompany or basically offer information to women to explain to them how they can have the interruption of a pregnancy. But the truth is that the high maternity mortality in Venezuela is the mortality is higher than in the rest of the region. There are many child mothers, and there are many unwanted pregnancies. So basically, this is kind of like the context. It's a context of a struggle that we are in right now. On March 28th, as I was saying, thousands of women and men too, we went to the streets for the decriminalization of abortion. Like last year, we also had a very large march last year. This march is mostly Chavista, but it brings together different sectors that are not Chavista. So this is actually, interestingly, a dispute or a battle that is being fought within Chavismo as well as with some allies that are outside of Chavismo but are that identify themselves as left. And particularly in this march, one of our big objectives was to make it be seen that there is a proposal for a new organic law. It's called the Organic Law for the Sexual Rights and Reproductive Rights of People. And this is a grassroots legislative proposal that would guarantee it passed the sexual and reproductive rights of women, teenagers, and the LGBTQI community. What this law does is open up what it would do is that it would open up for sexual education, access to contraceptives, and it would eliminate the four articles in the penal code that criminalize abortion. Now, this is a proposal, a law proposal, and because Venezuela is a participative and protagonic democracy, there is a channel so that the people can propose a law to the National Assembly. We have to gather 22,000 almost 22,000 signatures so that the law proposal will enter for first debate in the National Assembly. And then, of course, the National Assembly would vote in favor or against it. Up to now, we have 10,000 signatures collected, and we continue in this struggle to depenalize abortion in Venezuela.
I'm wondering why you consider this to be a major event. Do you consider that perhaps there was a change in the balance of forces as a result of this mobilization? We know these kinds of protests and mobilizations are constant present in Venezuela. What set this one apart for you?
Well, basically, this mobilization, as I said, it happened last year. It was large. This year, it's been growing. Basically, I think that the struggle for the decriminalization of abortion is growing. This is basically a continental struggle, right? Basically, in the whole, it's a global struggle. But basically, in the last few years, we have seen these marches and movements for the sexual and reproductive rights of women growing in the continent. And Venezuela, while it is at the tail end in terms of sexual and reproductive rights, it is not at the tail end in terms of women's disposition to fight for our rights. So I think it's obviously, it's an important struggle. It's an open debate, and right now, hopefully, we will be getting closer to this law, getting to the National Assembly, and that will for sure be news when that law gets to the National Assembly.
Yeah, I mean, I was with Cira and Ricardo and many others in this march that we had on September 28th. And I agree with Cira that this is like I feel like this is like the first time we're seeing like popular organizations from all political sectors like really united for one goal, which is to finally have someday legal abortion in Venezuela, because we know this is a problem of public health. Many activists who are very dedicated to this issue have reminded us time and again that abortion continues to be like one of the main causes of uh, maternal mortality in Venezuela. Like a lot of women are dying because of this. And there's also a huge problematic because many teenage girls there's an increase in pregnancy in teenage girls. So we also have to tackle that. And these past few days, I've been talking a lot with some of these amazing activists, feminist activists in Venezuela, and something that they are always saying is that Venezuela doesn't have any data about abortion, like official data about how many abortions are happening or how many women are dying because they're having unsafe abortions since 2016. So this is really this is awful, because how do you create public policies to to prevent these things from happening if you don't have any data, if you don't have any data available about this problem. So, yeah, I think there are a lot of things about this issue of sexual and reproductive rights and abortion that we truly need to talk about more and debate more in Venezuela and in the whole continent.
Yeah, just a quick comment on this matter, because feminist movements have grown a lot in recent years, and not just on the issue of abortion, which has of course been very active, as Cira and Andreína were just describing, but also others. For example, the fight against the fight to eliminate violence against women, which is also a very serious problem. There's a what's called a femicide monitor tracking all the cases of people who assassinate their wives or their partners, and using that, because as Andreína was saying, there's a bit of a shortcoming in terms of data collection from the state. So independently, people are collecting data to kind of pressure the state institutions to respond. And the other thing, just very briefly, that Cira mentioned in the beginning, but I think it's worth highlighting, is that feminist movement somehow understood that it's not a dilemma of whether you are Chavista or not, or whether you support the government in everything you do. Rather, you should build an independent agenda and then present those demands. I mean, as long as you are clear as to who you are fighting for and who you are, then those dilemmas are just superfluous. So in that sense, feminist movements were very active during the pandemic, for example, while everybody else was in a bit of a coma, not knowing what to do. They continued to organize and push forward their agenda, and I think that's been very inspiring to see.
You know, this conversation makes me think of this slogan that you hear on the streets, certainly a lot in these demonstrations: ni la tierra ni nuestros cuerpos son territorios de conquistas. Nor our bodies, nor our territories are lands or territories for conquest. And I think in a lot of ways, it's important to highlight precisely that the struggle for autonomy is also a personal struggle. And I think this is one of the issues that best highlights the need to defend that principle precisely. But I also think, you know, when we're talking about reproductive rights, when we're talking about women's health, it's important to take in consideration that Venezuela still remains a country under siege, under unilateral coercive measures, and that's had major effects on women's health and on reproductive rights. And I think, especially in that context, it's important for women to be able to, I mean, obviously always, but in this context, to be able to choose, because they know that they're operating under severe limitations when it comes to women's health.
That's right. Basically, access to contraceptives becomes all the more difficult in a situation like ours, with the sanctions, and the whole kind of like panorama actually makes it all the more pressing to decriminalize abortion. I wanted to mention just a couple of things very briefly. Ricardo was talking about the situation with gender-based violence, and last year 239 women were killed. This is a grassroots initiative that's actually basically organized by Utopics, a grassroots initiative that tracks how many women are killed in femicides. 239. It's a very, very high number, and this is data that has been self-gathered, so the numbers may actually be higher. I want to encourage everybody who is listening to us to actually read an article by Andreína about the march, also to read an interview that we did recently with Laura Cano. It's called The Struggle to Decriminalize Abortion. And we have a fair amount of content on the feminist struggle in Venezuela, so we encourage you to read our contents on that issue.
So we were talking just about the impact of sanctions, and obviously this is the issue every year. Unfortunately, we continue to see the application of these unilateral coercive measures and all the negative impacts that it implies. It's one of the topics that we cover extensively. I think it's one of the things where we have a responsibility to highlight, because people in the global north need to understand that sanctions sound like this, soft term, the soft power exercise. But the reality is that it's incredibly punishing. It has deadly consequences for the people who are the victims of US sanctions. So that brings us to our final story that we wanted to look at, which is the situation of the Venezuelan economy and the impact of sanctions. There's been this talk of Venezuela going through somewhat of an economic recovery. We know there's been a certain liberalization measures that have been put into place. We've seen a de facto dollarization of the economy. And obviously, this all has impacts on the working class and campesino population of Venezuela. And Andreína Chávez is our resident expert on this. Honestly, sometimes I'm really quite impressed at how she's able to capture these news stories on the topic, which are very difficult to try to digest, but also make it very understandable and tying it into the reality in Venezuela. So, Andreína, talk to us about this. Talk to us about the economy, about sanctions, and what it all means.
Thank you, José Luis. And it's so good to listen to everyone, analyzing everything about Venezuela, especially about communes and feminism. And before I begin, I just wanted to thank José Luis because he has made this podcast possible for a year, and he has produced so many amazing episodes. And so I just want to invite everyone who is listening to please listen to every episode of the podcast and to not miss it next year, because this is truly like the easiest way to find out everything that is going on in Venezuela and to actually hear what's going on from the people that are on the ground. So yes, thank you, José Luis. And now about the news story that I'm going to talk about. It is the economy and sanctions against Venezuela. And I just want to clarify that, of course, talking about this topic is very complex, and so I'm going to try to say something like very quick, and maybe everyone can join me later and explain more about it. So I think I need to begin with Chevron, because this is like the most important story of the moment. So Chevron is being granted a limited license for about 6 months to resume oil operations in Venezuela, and they can actually take that oil to the United States and only to the United States. This happened on November 26, right after the Venezuelan government sat down once again to talk with one sector of the Venezuelan opposition in Mexico. And Washington presented this new license given to Chevron as a positive consequence of the Mexico talks. And it was presented as if they were easing sanctions against Venezuela, and none of that is true. The truth is, Chevron had been lobbying Washington for a license to produce and sell Venezuelan oil for a very long time. So this is a corporation that has major oil projects in Venezuela, and for almost 3 years, it hasn't been able to produce or collect any profit because of the sanctions against Venezuela's oil industry. So, if you think about it, framing this license given to Chevron in the context of political talks between the Maduro government and the opposition is just a way of hiding that this is Washington helping Chevron obtain what it wants and making it look like they are easing sanctions against Venezuela without really doing it. Because Venezuela's economy, and especially the oil industry, is still completely under sanctions, completely blocked, and the Venezuelan people are still suffering from that. Like, we still have a huge migrant population, a huge amount of people that left the country because of the economic crisis. And although some people are coming back, the reality is that the majority can come back because we still don't have the conditions, the economic conditions to welcome all these people. So, and in fact, we still don't know how much Venezuela will get from Chevron resuming oil operations, because the license establishes like several conditions to block any profit for the Venezuelan government, for the Venezuelan state. So, but although Venezuela has, President Maduro has welcomed the license, and we already saw Venezuelan state oil company PDVSA and Chevron signing contracts about oil extraction. So there's a chance that we might find out next year if Venezuela is actually going to have any profit from this. And a lot of people are saying that that's probably the case because the Venezuelan government has some leverage to negotiate like conditions that are better for the Venezuelan people. So there's hope there. But President Maduro was actually speaking to the press only a few days ago, and he said that the Chevron license was a step in the right direction, but that was it. I mean, it's not something huge. The country's main demand continues to be eliminating all sanctions and the return of all the stolen funds and assets, so the country can actually begin a sustainable economic recovery. And what that brings me to the economy. So I think everybody knows that since last year, Venezuela has seen a small yet important economic stabilization after a long and still going economic crisis. And this is despite the country still being under sanctions. So last year, the country's GDP increased, inflation came down to single digits for the first time in many years. Just last April, several financial institutions were predicting that Venezuela's economy would grow even more, even up to 20% this year. So this is all good news. And there are several factors that contributed to this modest economic improvement. And first, I think we have to highlight that Venezuela has like a really solid alliance with countries like China, Iran, and Russia. And these relations have been key to slightly lifting oil production. I mean, obviously, the oil industry still has no hope of reaching the production levels it had before sanctions. But nonetheless, this small increase has had a positive effect on the economy because there's a little more income, a little more revenue. So oil production is a huge factor in this somehow economic stabilization. But besides oil production going up a little, the government has also taken some, let's say, interesting economic measures. Um, I say interesting because basically this is like a liberalization of the economy. They have removed taxes on some imports, lift price and exchange controls, and with the exception of wages, the country is more or less dollarized now. Like you can use dollars to do anything here now. So the economic liberalization, and especially the fact that we are now a dollarized economy, have brought like new dynamics into the country. We have now some sectors of the population who have privileged access to dollars, and they have taken advantage of the tax exemptions to buy goods and to sell them in Venezuela. And that's why there's been like a boom of expensive shops and restaurants and other businesses, although this is mostly in Caracas, mostly in the capital. And then, of course, we also have some people who have access to dollars because they have family in other countries that send them money. And then we have other people that are working for private companies that pay them in dollars. And I just want to clarify that these private companies, they aren't paying like huge salaries, like huge wages. No. I mean, but they are significantly higher than what someone can earn in the public sector, for example. And there's also a really downside about working for private companies, which is that people are sort of like being forced to sacrifice some benefits, like social security, for example. But nonetheless, there's like this small group of the population that have been able to have some financial freedom because of this dollarization. Now we also have the public sector employees, and the public sector employees are the ones who have complained the most, and with good reason, about dollarization because they don't receive wages in dollars and their salaries are not being increased to compensate for that. So most of them have to rely on second jobs or do anything else so they can actually afford to buy food and to improve their conditions. And in general, besides the public sector employees, in general, the Venezuela population doesn't have access to dollars. and they haven't been able to improve their living conditions in any significant way, despite this small economic recovery that we're seeing. So all these liberal measures taken by the government, they have brought some life into the economy, but they have also increased social inequality. So, I mean, there's a lot I can say about social inequality, but I don't want to talk about this alone. So I think I'm going to leave it here so we can all give our analysis about this so-called economic stabilization and especially the social inequality that we are seeing now.
Yeah, this was a great summary, or even a great double summary by Andreína on sanctions and the economy. Indeed, the economy, we call them interesting measures in terms of liberalization and so on, but they might be unusual here in this context and all that we're used to. But if we look at them from a distance, they are very orthodox measures when it comes to what countries do in times of economic crisis. And indeed, there is a worry that there is an economic recovery. It's very visible, but it's very unequally distributed. But maybe I'll leave the comments on the economy and worrying inequality to Cira, and go back to sanctions that Andreína made a very good summary, but I just wanted to add some complementary bits. First of all, I think I don't need permission to plug in our own content in our own podcast. So we have indeed created a lot of content on sanctions to help people understand that these measures are not just uh, troubling for Maduro and his associates, which is very much the idea that the corporate media tries to pass, but rather this is collective punishment, and this is not coming from us. This was a classification by the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and also UN experts on human rights have used this expression. So this is collective punishment on the Venezuelan population, and with the precise goal of creating as much suffering as necessary to trigger regime change. But of course, this hasn't happened. And when we were talking in the beginning of the Biden administration trying to recalibrate its strategy towards Guaido, it also wants to recalibrate its sanction strategy, but not out of any concern for the well-being of the Venezuelan population, just in terms of seeing what's the most effective way to oust the Maduro government. And this takes us to Chevron, because I think Andreína's conclusion that this, for the time being, will benefit Chevron, whether it will benefit Venezuela still remains to be seen. There's a lot of debate on what the license allows or doesn't. Even in the best case scenario, I mean, the most benevolent interpretation we can make of the license, the gains for Venezuela are limited. It also has to do with the fact that these projects that have been stopped require a lot of investment, and that's not going to happen in the near future. So I think a good way to put it is, like Maduro said, it's a first step, perhaps the first significant step after all these maximum pressure measures that were put in place until the beginning of 2020 or 2021 rather. And this is the first measure in the opposite direction that we've seen, but it's still limited. If it's the prelude to other wider and more interesting licenses, then it will be positive. For the time being, it's just a way to keep the conversation going. I mean, just to put it in terms of figures, the benefits that Venezuela will get from the rise in production in these Chevron joint ventures, we should remind people that Chevron is a minority stakeholder in 4 joint projects in Venezuela. Venezuelan law demands that the Venezuelan state-owned company PDVSA always hold the majority of shares in joint oil projects. So the benefits coming from Chevron reaching the maximum production in its joint projects would be in the hundreds of millions of dollars every year. And we should contrast that to the consequences of the US oil embargo that was levied in January 2019. This is always the main measure that I highlight. And this, assuming oil prices at around $60 a barrel, of course, this is much higher right now. This causes damages or lost income around 11 billion a year. So we should take into account just how hard the Venezuelan economy and the oil industry has been hit by these measures, and just how not that significant the Chevron license can be in that context. There's still a long way to go, and then maybe we'll get into this when we talk about what's to come in 2023, what all the different actors are looking for in this negotiation with elections in the horizon. But it's important, and that's something that we always try to address when it's misreported in the corporate media, that sanctions are still essentially all in place and causing a lot of damage to the Venezuelan population, to the Venezuelan people, despite this modest economic recovery that we have been talking about.
First, I want to second what Andreína was saying about José Luis's work. It's really extraordinary. So thank you, José Luis. And also want to remind everybody who's listening to us that we are in the midst of a fundraiser, of our annual fundraiser. So support Venezuelanalysis. I want to basically go along what Ricardo was mentioning it in relation to sanctions. Basically, the amount of money that Venezuela has lost through this criminal policy of the U.S. is between 20 and 30 billion dollars up to now, between basically money in banks and assets. So it's really extraordinary. I wanted to highlight that, of course, the impact of this is not only on the government, but mostly on the lives and bodies of people here in Venezuela. And we have indeed been being visiting some of the communes that are building an alternative in a project that we call communal resistance, that really should be called communal resistance and the construction of a new society. Because one of the interesting things about Venezuelans is that they are not they don't assume themselves as victims, but most Venezuelans assume themselves as subjects of transformation. I wanted to highlight that, and then I wanted to go very quickly back to the issue with economic recovery, which indeed in Caracas, especially in the center of Caracas, is very visible. Just last week, I went to the east of Caracas, which is the richest part of town, because I had a dentist appointment there. I generally don't go there. And the dentist is near, I don't know what to call it, a super extraordinary luxury store that's called Avanti. And I actually popped in, and it's full of Louis Vuitton purses and all sorts of other extraordinarily expensive things, like televisions, TV sets in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And right next to it, there's car dealerships with Ferrari and Hummer cars. So the economic recovery is indeed very unequal. I think it has to do to a great degree with the kinds of policies that have been promoted. Were those the only possible policies that could be promoted or not? Well, that's up for a debate, no? But the restriction of wages, the liberalization of prices and the exchange rate, and the lifting of taxes on imports has really created a situation where, well, the rich are getting richer and the poor are not coming out of the pretty dire situation in which they were a few months or years ago. I just wanted to highlight that, but I do want to highlight it again with kind of like an eye on hope, because we do see that the Venezuelan people are struggling and are building an alternative society through communes, with many things stacked against themselves, but with the intention and commitment to build a better world.
And to be honest, that hope expresses itself internationally. As the only staff member who isn't based in Venezuela, I'm constantly talking to my colleagues and comrades here in Mexico about our need to pay attention to what's happening in Venezuela. They are still charting the course. They're still helping us serve as a guiding light in terms of what needs to be done and what can be done. And so we wanted to close this special episode with a really brief discussion about what to expect in 2023. So, we're not politólogos, opinólogos, as they say, who peer into their crystal ball and trying to predict what's going to happen. But we do know that there's going to be certain things that are going to come up, even though, Venezuela is one of the hardest countries to predict what's going to happen with things happening so quickly. But nonetheless, we wanted to have this conversation. And we talked a little bit about economic recovery, but I wanted to talk very briefly about that and what it implies for the next year. I'm kind of convinced that we're unlikely to see any kind of substantial sanctions relief until there are elections. I think it's part of the US strategy to try to put off any kind of sanctions relief until there is elections, because sanctions relief would boost the economy, and that would boost the fortunes of the Maduro government. And the US is looking to do everything it can to prevent that from happening. And so it's going to be a very tough road up ahead in that regard. It makes me worried because I think history has shown us that the US is perfectly capable of continuing to inflict this kind of collective punishment in order to secure its objectives. We saw it in Nicaragua with in the 90s with the defeat of the Sandinista government there many years ago. And I think it was very much driven by US policy that was seeking to make life as difficult as possible for the population in order to, secure legitimacy through the ballot box, as they did with the election of the opposition there. And I think something similar is set to happen in Venezuela in terms of trying to deny any kind of relief in order to favor the opposition's chances in the elections, which we know are just around the corner. So, real brief, I want to hear from people. What do you think is going to be the major things on the calendar in 2023?
So, Jose Luis, I think what you were saying is absolutely correct because, sanctions are still blocking any possibility for sustainable economic recovery in Venezuela, and there are no signs of sanctions going nowhere in the near future. And we all know that Washington has made it clear that for them to lift these illegal sanctions against Venezuela, they want to see what they like to call free elections, which is just their way to say that they want to see an end to the Maduro government. They want to see an end to the socialist project that began in Venezuela almost 25 years ago with Chávez. So one of the main things we're going to see in 2023 is, of course, this debate about elections. We know that Venezuela is going to have presidential elections because that is what it says in the constitution. So, the main debate is going to be about how are we going to continue involving all the opposition sectors in Venezuela in this electoral path, because we all know that the opposition that is talking in Mexico with the Venezuelan government is only one sector of the opposition, is the more radical sector of the opposition, is the one that has asked for sanctions, is the one that has tried to topple the Maduro government with violent coup attempts. But there are more opposition groups in Venezuela, and the government is talking to all of them. He's talking to all of them to make sure that the electoral process is truly inclusive and democratic as possible.
In Venezuela, we can make predictions at our own peril. But just very briefly, some of the stuff that I'm keeping an eye on for 2023. The predictions are that economic recovery is going to continue, but there are some warning signs. For example, there's been significant currency devaluation in the last couple of months. Inflation, even though it's still single digits, and we should mention single digits monthly inflation, not year-to-year inflation. And it remains to be seen whether it will remain stable, or if at some point the government will be faced with this dilemma where it has to either reintroduce regulation, which will kind of antagonize a private sector that has been more or less on board with everything that's been implemented in recent times. So that's something to keep an eye on, assuming that the global sanctions context is still unchanged, which is, at least for a time being, the most likely scenario. Because as Jose Luis was saying, the US does not really want to boost Chavismo's chances in an upcoming presidential election. It's scheduled for 2024, although there are ever louder rumors that it's going to be moved forward to 2023. That would have to be the result of some kind of negotiation between the Venezuelan government and the hardline opposition, although we know it really is negotiated with the United States. So if the elections are brought forward, what does the Venezuelan government get in exchange? That's still very much the jostling that's taking place to get to this electoral context, which is absolutely pivotal in the best possible conditions. And the final story, which we shouldn't get into too much detail, but I'm sure we'll analyze in the future, is that Citgo is the Venezuelan oil subsidiary in the US, is currently undergoing a court order auction process, which will move forward in 2023. That has to do with creditors. So there's been a long process with a lot of opposition, complicity, there's no other way of putting it, that has put in peril Venezuela's most important asset abroad. So as always, lots of things on the horizon, and with a little self-advertising, Venezuelanalysis is where you can keep up with all of that.
That is indeed right. And we will be seeing almost for sure elections, as Ricardo and Andreína were saying. They might happen in July, they may happen in December. The elections will be presidential and National Assembly elections. The presidential elections are actually due in December of 2024, so these would be elections. This would be pushed forward, and we will see what happens with those processes. But we actually are pretty much convinced that the sovereign forces will remain, because basically the opposition, the right wing, even though they have a pretty powerful ally, which is U.S. imperialism, is actually very weak. They are divided, and they do not have a project that they can show as their own. And well, next year we will also see the continuation of struggles of grassroots movements organizing for a better society. We will see more feminist marches for sure. It will be an interesting year, and we will keep you up to date with it.
Great. I think we'll wrap it up there. Thanks so much, everybody. Andreína, Cira, Ricardo, as always, excellent analysis. It's such a privilege to work with everybody on this team. It's honestly some of the best work I've ever done as a journalist and as a political organizer. I want to thank everybody for joining us for this special year-end episode. The Venezuelanalysis podcast brings you independent, on-the-ground, English-language coverage of Venezuela and the Bolivarian process. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Telegram. And remember that our work is 100% funded by readers. And we're actually in the middle of our 2022 fundraising drive. So please consider making a one-time